Canon just announced the R7 and the R10. Some say that these two cameras line up nicely to replace the Canon 90D and the Rebel series with rapid continuous stills shooting and oversampled 4K video. Details coming up, but first I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. The Canon R10 has a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. The R7 has a 32.5 megapixel APS-C sensor. And I know what you're thinking, this is the same sensor found in the 90D and the M50 Mark II. They're old sensors. Canon hasn't done anything new here whatsoever. Well, that's not true. According to DP Review, Canon has said that these are completely new sensors. They're based off the architecture of the 90D and the M50, but they are completely net new sensors. But what's interesting about these two cameras is what they're really designed to replace. The R10, well, it feels like a replacement of the Rebel series or the 850D, whereas the R7 feels more like a replacement for the 90D and somewhere between the 90D and the 7D Mark II. We get the very same Digic X processor found in the 1DX Mark III, and this is really significant because it's very fast. And the 1DX Mark III only gets one of those Digic X processors, whereas the previous iterations of the 1 series had dual Digic processors. It's a really big deal. The R5, the R6 also get that Digic X processor. So bringing that Digic X processor to the R7 and the R10 opens up a whole new level of speed and performance. And so with that, let's take a look at the stills capabilities. When it comes to mechanical shooting, both of these cameras can shoot 15 frames per second. And that's really, really significant. In terms of electronic, well, the R10 can shoot 23 frames per second and the R7 can shoot 30 frames per second. So pretty impressive in terms of the overall performance of what these cameras can do. And really, these cameras are designed to shoot mechanical mode, and I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. To me and many others, the R7 doesn't feel like a true successor to the 7D Mark II. In fact, it feels like more of a successor to the 90D leading up to the 7D Mark II. It doesn't feel like a true successor, and when we look at the pricing of this camera, it's $14.99. Back in 2014, when the 7D Mark II was announced, it was around $16.99. That's significantly higher than that $14.99. So it's going to take a little bit more time to dig through what is different between these cameras, what has been improved. But in many regards, the R7 is a better camera than the 7D Mark II, and in other areas, not nearly as good. Now the R10, well, it's priced at $979. Now you can pre-order them today, but you can't take delivery right away. And if you're interested in pre-ordering either of these cameras, I've got links to B&H down below. The R7 and the R10 use the same mount as the Canon R5 and the R10. They do have a new mount calling it the RFS, but this is a way of, well, separating lenses designed for the cheaper APS-C censored cameras versus the full frame. So if you're looking at buying a lens and the price doesn't give it away, you can go, oh, RFS, this is designed for APS-C censored cameras. However, if you do like these lenses and you own an R5 or an R6 or one of the other EOS R cameras, you can actually take these lenses and put them on an R5 or an R6 without any adapter. And if you want to take those EF lenses or even the EFS lenses, for $99, you can use the EF to RF adapter and mount them onto an R5 or an R6 or even the R10 and the R7. So the good news is we get to use all those lenses from the EF mount. I think there's somewhere around 107 lenses. Plus you can use all the RF lenses out there for the R7 and the R10. Both the R7 and the R10 get dual pixel autofocus, the same version found in the R5 and the R6. Well, actually, that's not quite true. It's more akin to the version found in the R3, so it is the second edition. It's not the same edition that came out in the R5C. So we get animal eye detection, human eye detection, pet eye detection, vehicle detection. But it's really that animal and bird eye detection is what is most interesting to many looking at the R7 because it's designed for people who want to shoot wildlife. And in Canon's promo video, all they do is pepper this with a lot of wildlife pictures. So we get that highly reliable autofocus system for the R5 and the R6, the 1DX Mark III, into the R7 and the R10. However, Jordan and Chris Nichols at DP Review did find out that when you're shooting continuous tracking, if there are any branches or other debris in the area, for example, if you're shooting birds, the autofocus system will jump around a little bit. It's not nearly as accurate. Whereas if the bird is out in the open or it's sitting on a branch without any obstructions, the autofocus system is quite reliable. Now, in terms of low light performance, the Canon EOS R7 beats out the R10 by one stop, sensitive down to -5 EV versus -4 EV on the R10. Both cameras offer very detailed and sharp 4K video thanks to the oversampled 4K modes or 4K fine. On the R7, we get 7K oversampled 4K at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. And of course, on the R10, we get 6K oversampled 4K at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. And that's really, really significant. And on the Canon EOS R7, we also get Canon Log 3, which is a really big deal. So that gives us 10-bit, it gives us more dynamic range in the luminance. So when it comes to shadows, highlights, and midtones, we just get a more representative look as to what we see with our normal eyes. But there is one thing, there's a bit of a downer here that we don't get all eye. I'm really surprised. Now, Canon Log 3, I should paraphrase this. The Canon R7 is the only one to get Canon Log 3. The R10 doesn't get Canon Log 3. And when it comes to all eye, the R10 doesn't get all eye, and neither does the R7. And I'm really surprised that it offers Canon Log 3, but we don't get all eye. We get IPB and IPB Lite. And I don't know if we might get it in a future firmware update, but I really doubt it. The R6 didn't get all eye, and still 2 years later in firmware updates hasn't received all eye. It's just really bizarre. The 90D didn't get all eye, but the 80D and the 70D did as well. I don't know what Canon's doing with all eye. I don't know why they're treating it as a really luxury feature that you have to spend somewhere around $4,000 in the Canon EOS R5 to get it. I'm really tired of that, but there is some really, really good news. When it comes to video, there is one thing we're getting in both the R7 and the R10 that you're just going to be surprised by. Both cameras no longer have that 30-minute record limit. That's right, there's no longer any 30-minute record limit. I think it's now extended to something like 6 hours, the same in the Canon EOS R3. My friend Gordon Laing ran a few tests, and the first was in 7K oversample 4K or 4K fine. He was able to go 2 hours and 13 minutes before the battery ran out. But one thing of interest, that overheat warning has improved. Instead of just getting this flashing overheat warning, what we do get now is an improved graphic with 10 bars showing us where it is in terms of thermals, where it is in terms of that heat. And when Gordon Laing was doing the test and he ran it for 2 hours and 13 minutes and the battery ran dead, he only had about 4 bars showing, so you could theoretically go for a whole lot longer if you used USB charging. But again, this was inside, so it wasn't in a high heat environment. Now, not included in his video, he did tweet to me that he was able to get almost 4 hours, 3 hours and 57 minutes recording in 1080. So significantly longer recording in 1080. And that's really good news. So we no longer have that 30-minute record limit. And not only that, the overheat is so much better, so much more reliable and usable. But again, Gordon's in the UK. It's not very hot this time of year. I'm really curious to see how this camera performs in the hot summers of North America, Europe, Asia. See how long we can record, because the Canon EOS R5, if you spend some time shooting stills, you might only get 5 to 10 minutes of shooting. So some definite improvements there. But outside of the 7K and 6K oversample 4K modes, when it comes to 4K 60, when it comes to 4K 30, when it comes to 4K 120 frames per second, 1080 120 frames per second, those other modes are soft. Now, for a hobbyist, for casual shooting, you're really not going to have any problems with the softer images. It's for more of those of us that are more professional videographers, where we want as much detail as we can, and we want to shoot in those 4K oversampled modes. And here's my recommendation for you. If you're going to be shooting in 4K, well, default to 4K 30 oversample, whether it's 7K oversampled on the R7 or 6K oversampled on the, R6, on the R10. Shoot in the oversample modes, you're going to get much better detail. And even if your final product is going to be 1080, when you take that 4K and you further oversample it in your nonlinear editing software, whether it be Final Cut or Premiere or DaVinci Resolve, the level of sharpness in 1080 is going to be a whole lot better than if you just shot in 1080 alone. There are an awful lot of pros and cons to both of these cameras. One of the biggest pros for the R7 is it comes with in-body image stabilization. Coupled with lens stabilization and that smaller sensor, it produces very smooth, very steady footage. However, the R10, it doesn't get in-body image stabilization, although it does get digital stabilization. And here's my recommendation for you. Never shoot in digital image stabilization unless you're really, really holding that steady, because we tend to get warping or other strange effects depending on your shutter speed or other characteristics. And here's the deal. You can't change that in post. Whereas if you shoot your footage and it's a little bit, jumpy, you can always turn on image stabilization through software. And if it doesn't work out and you get strange effects, you can always turn it off. Another pro to the R7 is that it's weather sealed, more weather sealed than you're going to get in the Canon EOS R10. And if you're shooting wildlife, if you're constantly shooting outside, especially in climates like British Columbia and Canada or the United Kingdom, where it can rain at almost any moment's notice. You can be out there in blue sky and before long you've got rain. So having a weather sealed body is also another benefit. The R7 is a little bit more heavier than the R10 at 420 grams versus about 620 grams. But the R7 is considerably lighter than the 7D Mark II. While still using a magnesium alloy for the shell, it's definitely a whole lot lighter as a camera, but the R10 is also considerably smaller than the R7. I think I definitely like the grip of the R7 a little bit more than the R10, but still for entry level, for hobbyists, for those looking to shoot casually, I think the R10 is a pretty solid camera, both with video and stills. I mean, look at that mechanical rate of 15 frames per second, a rate previously limited to cameras like the $10,000 or $6,000 US 1DX Mark II. Really impressive that we can get 15 frames per second mechanical, and of course video getting 6K oversampled 4K, producing very sharp and detailed image. So there's a lot of pros and cons for both of these cameras, and well, let's continue with some more of the pros and cons. Both of these cameras use UHS 2 SD card slots. The R10 gets a single slot, whereas the R7 gets 2 slots. The shutter on the R7 goes to 1/8,000th of a second, whereas on the R10 it's 1/4,000th of a second. The R7 gets the LPE6N battery, whereas the R10 gets the LPE17 battery. Because it now has a USB-C port, you can actually charge the batteries using that port. So basically you can shoot continuously for as long as you want. However, if you're using those older LPE6 batteries, it doesn't support continuous charging, so you're going to have to do that through taking the batteries out, plugging them in, charging them up. So you definitely want to use those LPE6N batteries, and I know they're not cheap, I know they're expensive, but what I highly recommend, if you're buying the R7, get a couple of these batteries. I bought 2 extra with my R5, and they work really, really well for me. Now, when I'm shooting in the studio like I am here, well, I hook up to an external power support, so I'm not wasting the batteries. I only use the batteries when I'm out doing run and gun type stuff. So what do I not like about these cameras? Well, there's a few things. Like I said, there's a lot of pros and cons, and unfortunately, some of the cons are pretty annoying, such as no all-eye in either of these two cameras. The R7 does have the ability that when you turn it off, when you want to replace a lens, it automatically closes the shutter for you, so that way you can protect the sensor from dust. However, the R10 doesn't have this capability, so that's kind of one of those annoyances too. I really like having that automatically that shutter automatically closing, protecting this sensor from dust. I've had the R5 for almost 2 years now, and I can tell you I've never had to clean the sensor, and I've never had any dust showing up on it in any way whatsoever. However, every now and then, as I do change the lenses, I do use a cleaner to remove any dust from inside the camera body, because once you open up that sensor, dust can get in. So you still want to practice some regular maintenance to make sure that dust doesn't find its way onto the sensor. The R7 has both a headphone and a mic jack, but the R10 doesn't have a headphone jack. And that is a bit of an issue for some, not for others. But where it really kind of chased me is both of these cameras have that HDMI port, the micro, not the mini, not the full size. We get a micro HDMI port, and especially on these more entry-level cameras where people aren't aware of, they haven't been shooting a long enough time to realize how easy it is to damage your camera by not using that cable manager. I think there was a missed opportunity here to put in at least a mini port. I can see so many repairs coming because of people weren't using that cable adapter and damaged the camera. That's really annoying. And of course, not having all eye on either of these two cameras, but it's kind of hard to look at these cameras and say, yeah, they're garbage, they're junk, they're terrible, because, well, they really do offer an awful lot. And while many don't think that these are true replacements, well, the R7 isn't a true replacement of the 7D Mark II, it's definitely a good replacement of the 90D and punches much higher than the 90D. The 90D has very soft 4K video, but the R7, with 7K oversample 4K, offers really incredible detailed video, and because it has that 1.6 crop factor, it's perfect for wildlife video shooting, and in terms of stills with 15 frames per second mechanical, that's pretty powerful. And I know the buffer's only good for about 100 shots, but if you've ever shot wildlife, you realize that 100 shots isn't that bad. Last year, when I took out the 100mm f2.8 here with my Canon R5, I was shooting insects on flowers. It's very, very challenging because you're getting up really, really close, and your depth of field is, you're talking razor thin. So you're trying to shoot them, and you're going to shoot very, very fast. And I would hold down the shutter button for about half a second, a third of a second, at time, and I would chimp to see if the focus was nailed. Sometimes I nailed it, sometimes I didn't, because these little critters are moving. By the time I got home, I had over 1,000 shots, and that was even holding down the shutter for half or a third of a second at a time. You don't want to shoot holding down that shutter button for like 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, or even 20 seconds. The only time where I've held down the shutter button for 20 seconds is when I was doing reviews of Angelbird CF Express cards, the AV Pro Mark IIs, and I wanted to see what they were capable of, and I could hold them down in electronic mode, hold down the shutter button for 20 seconds, and I stopped continuously shooting at 20 frames per second. It was truly impressive. Well over 400, 500 shots during that time. Really, really impressive stuff. But it's great for a test, but actual use case, I think 100 is usable. But on the R10, where you're getting about 30 frames per second, you definitely might run into some problems. It's great for enthusiasts. It's great for those that are casual shooters that might want to try wildlife photography, or anything where you want to hold down that shutter button for half a second or even a second, like water skiing or your son or your family member doing sports. I think it's definitely useful. But in those modes, you definitely want to shoot with a mechanical shutter and not the electronic, because the rolling shutter is not as good as we might expect. Not sure the reasoning for that is. Don't know what Canon has done here. But we look at the Canon EOS R5 with the same image processor, and the rolling shutter, even in 8K RAW, is relatively insignificant. The kind of rolling shutter you'd expect to see in a Hollywood motion picture. Putting together these videos takes a lot of time and effort, and I put out probably about 3 or 4 rumor videos prior to this in yesterday alone, so this was much easier to shoot. And I want to say a special thanks to you, Jordan. Thank you for permission for allowing me to use clips from your review videos in this video here, because I'm not big enough where Canon wants to send me out models to test, and as long as I'm doing rumors, they probably don't want to have anything to do with me. And Gordon, once again, thank you very much for letting me use clips from your videos too. I love how detailed your videos are and how you just dig into it. And we get to all the questions that I have, certainly about these two cameras, were answered by your videos. One thing for those of you watching at home, though, to keep in mind is DP Review had the actual production models of the cameras, and they took a very conceptual level view, basically asking all the questions you might want to know if you're looking at buying either of these cameras. Whereas Gordon Laing still answered all those questions you wanted to, but took a much deeper level. He produced a separate video for the R7 and a separate video for the R10, both of them being around somewhere around 18 to 15 minutes. And he also did a separate review video of the 2 new lenses, the 18 to 55 and the 18 to 150 millimeter. But guys, thank you so much. As a young channel that's just about to hit 29,000 subscribers, it's hard to get the love out there. Getting access to cameras and lenses is very, very difficult. I do get sent a lot of memory cards, batteries, lighting, and a lot of that stuff, which is great and helpful for doing reviews. But when it comes to reviewing major camera releases like the R7 and the R10, nobody's sending me those cameras. So I really do appreciate you letting me use clips from your videos to help me support this channel and help me improve what I produce. So again, sincerely, guys, thank you so much. And Gordon, I spelled your name correctly this time. One last thing before signing off. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest camera gear news and rumors like the R7 and the R10, or the upcoming Fujifilm X-H2S, or if you like my historical videos where I look at all the previous 1 series cameras leading up to the R1, then go ahead and subscribe, but make sure you choose all notifications. By choosing all notifications, as soon as I publish a video, you're going to get notified by YouTube, so that way you stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.